I'm Alistair Bayford, designer of the Family Monsters Garden, which exhibited at last year's RHS Chelsea Flower Show. Now I've been asked to do a series of short clips to give you the background to the garden, why we exhibited at the show, and to reflect on the amazing achievements of last year. So why exhibit at Chelsea? Well, 2 years ago, if I wind the clock back to the initial discussions, both organisations involved, Family Action and ID Verdi, which is the organisation that I work for, saw or seized an opportunity to jointly celebrate significant anniversaries. So Family Action's celebrating 150 years supporting families in the UK, and ID Verdi celebrating 100 years caring for the environment. We maintain numerous parks and open spaces across the UK, and we're involved in the enhancement and creation of new open spaces for the enjoyment of local communities. And those services are delivered throughout the UK and Europe. The second reason was to promote a campaign, and that campaign was the Family Monsters Project, a year-long campaign to highlight the everyday pressures that families face, and to promote the charity Family Action and the work that it does with supporting families across the UK. So what was my brief? Well, it was to bring a campaign to life in a garden, in a physical sense. And I was shown a video, which was a very short clip promoting the Family Monsters Project. And whilst watching it, and certainly when we shared the video with a number of suppliers that worked in collaboration with us, it resonated with them, it certainly resonated with me. I could associate myself with at least 2 of the 4 case study examples that were kind of demonstrated in that video. And for me, that was the start of a long journey to try and unravel the project and its aims, and to replicate that in a garden to take to the show, which would subtly have the undertone of the campaign, but also be a practical, functional garden with lots of ideas for people to take away, and that had the ability to be relocated after the show. So the first task for me was to bring the project to life, and I had to find a way of representing the monsters. So decided that we were going to use stone to do that, and needed a stone that had a kind of a journey or a life cycle from large and chunky, so this here, to much more manageable cobbles. So we selected a number of different kind of stone types that are quite common to kind of glacial environments or the history in terms of geology, and what they were to represent, these large boulders, which were all kind of varying shapes, sizes, textures and colours. And to be honest, I mean, I'm holding one of the smallest boulders that featured in the garden. They were all supposed to represent this weight on one shoulder, and the fact that some monsters just can't be carried, they can't be moved, can't be shifted without support. And those that were movable, like this one, you couldn't quite hold on to them for very long before they became uncomfortable. So the understory around the garden itself, the boundary, was home to these monsters, and they weren't necessarily all visible. Some were hidden, some were free to see, some were set behind other things, so that they would naturally reveal as you explored the garden. And the journey through the space ultimately led to a pool at the top of the platform in the central area of the garden, where it was lined with cobbles. And the whole idea, and it's kind of telling, I've just put that boulder down, and immediately the weight is so much more reduced and so much more manageable, and it signifies that if you seek help or seek support, hopefully your problems will reduce in size, become more manageable, but equally they don't quite go away, and they form almost part of our character and our life experience, and some carry scars from their experiences for the rest of their lives. And we wanted to kind of signify that problems can be dealt with, to acknowledge that sometimes they don't go away, but the whole theme was to represent the diversity of problems that families face, from financial difficulty, bereavement, long-term ill health, and just the general life challenges of bringing up families as either single parents or working parents. And I think we did that in this story of boulders kind of through either fluvial, glacial or tidal action eroding down to smaller problems in the cobbles. So the setting of the garden was really important. We wanted a garden that was 360-degree viewing for a reason. Traditionally, gardens at Chelsea have 2 or 3 boundaries, and the 360 viewing for me was about being able to demonstrate and articulate that problems aren't the same for different people, and when looked at from different angles they can appear very different. So we were able to do that in the setting that we had. People were able to walk around the garden, experience its different aspects and its different vistas and views into and importantly across the space. But the garden was also amoebic in shape, and that was really to play on this idea that problems aren't defined, they're not circular, they're not square, they're not constrained. They can adapt and respond to the various situations that people will find themselves in. One problem can lead on to another, and they are very different for each person experiencing the problem. Something that I might be able to cope with quite well, someone else might struggle through that experience. So the garden had a single journey. Its destination was a place of refuge, a safe place, somewhere that was calm and tranquil. And there was a single path to it. It was sloped, so it was uphill, representative of an uphill struggle that someone might go through when they are experiencing a problem. And along that route there were a series of individual boulders that were large enough to accommodate one person, and that really played on the isolation that someone might experience when they're going through a problem in their lives and they're not seeking support, or they haven't got that support network that would get them through. The path itself, that was made out of a loose self-binding gravel, which was playing on this whole thing about an unsure footing, things moving below your feet and you're not feeling stable in that position. So the uphill struggle, once you'd got to the destination, which was this safe place, the surface changed to something that was bound, something that was rigid, that had sure footing and was stable. And in this central space, this coming together, the space was large enough to accommodate a family, a group of friends, and at the centre of it was a bench not too dissimilar to this one that I'm sat on here, large enough to accommodate more than one person. The space itself was elevated in the tree canopy so that you were closer to nature, that you were enclosed, but that enclosure was partial. You had views out, you would feel sheltered, but you were also in an elevated position with one access path, so you could always see people entering and exiting the garden, and you could view out. So we build our castles on a hill for a reason. It's a natural line of defence. So for users of the space, they would feel certainly more sheltered and safe and secure, and in an atmosphere that was very tranquil and calming. So the trees were incredibly important. They were there to kind of signify and illustrate the generations of our families, from the pioneer species of birch and hazel, which represented the young, our young adults, to this kind of quirky, gnarly Pinus nigra, which represented a matriarchal grandmother, or a mother, or a father, or a grandfather. And none of the trees were perfect. They all had these splits, twin leaders, leaning stems, scars from previous damage. You would walk past them in a nursery if you were selecting them for a project. They had great form, but they had these imperfections, and just like us humans, we heal eventually. The plants and their ability to heal and overcome, be it damage from broken stems or growing into the light and correcting themselves. I wanted to kind of demonstrate through the trees and the selection of the species that our families are made up of, you know, old and young, and they can overcome their problems, they can overcome their scars, they can still carry those scars into future years. And I think the trees and the way in which they were put together really pulled that thing together in the garden. So the planting was incredibly important. It had two aims. The first was to represent the diversity of families in the UK today. So there were native species, there were cultivars of native species that have been bred, there were introduced species and what we consider settled species that ultimately are commonplace in our gardens today. And the second aim was to create this very calming, tranquil environment. So I've got some here. I have a habit of the plants following me around. I am a plantsman, and any garden that I've ever been involved with, or any landscape I've ever been involved with, some of those plants stay with me forever and follow me around, either in pots, and I replant them in the gardens that I occupy. And I just wanted to give some examples of how we'll be using a very green and white palette with some highlights and hints of colour, but really playing on textural qualities of the plants and the sizing and scale of their leaves. So if I take a few examples, so Acanthus spinosa, very prickly, kind of a very different shaped leaf, and glossy in appearance, to this Lamium ovala, which you know, has got a broader leaf. Certainly looks a bit more flimsy. I mean, it's only been off its plant for a little while, and it's already starting to suffer the consequences of the sun. But the Lamium has these really fine and interesting flowers, which have got hints of burgundy to them. And if you kind of know the story behind the centipede and the fairies, these hidden details that I think are quite magical when it comes to plants and how children might interact with that. The ferns were quite important too. There were areas of shade in the garden, and we've got two here, so Polystichum setiferum and Asplenium scolopendrium. And what's great about ferns is that as they emerge, they unfold. So there's these periods of animation in the planting as they emerge from winter. And again, kind of textural qualities, size and scale, gloss against matte, all sorts of contrasts throughout the planting. Then we had some plants with flowers that were hidden. So this Polygonatum odoratum, you kind of have to really look hard to see these hanging flowers that you wouldn't necessarily appreciate if you were looking at the plant from above. We had Gallium odoratum, so woodruff, throughout both the shady and semi-shady spaces in the garden, and that created quite a nice blanket to the space, this kind of constant green base to the planting, through which you'd have this introduction of grasses. So Lagula nivea, it's got these interesting hairs running up the leaves and these flowers that almost suspend themselves in the air, to contrasting against things like Astrantia and Alchemilla. Now Alchemilla, that's a weed in my garden. It just grows everywhere, but as a child I always remember how dewdrops and rain would settle on the leaves, and again, a planting scheme that isn't necessarily floriferous has ways of contributing greatly to people's interest and enjoyment and the animation of the space. And then one of my favourite images of the garden and the planting is the back space, the shady area, where these tiarellas, Spring Symphony, just lit up that space like little candles, and these kind of small foam flowers that are white with these pink tops just look like candles, and that was probably, I suppose, my favourite element of the garden. A very small detail, but brought the garden to life. And we had some Nectaroscordum, Sicculum, and again they're a plant that have got a bit of mystery to them. They punctuated up through the planting, and again the flowers hang, so you really have to look quite hard to appreciate their beauty. And I've got a few others here. The most important, I think, was the Hydrangea quercifolia, which was a sentinel to the entrance to the garden. Unlike my small specimen here, the hydrangea was in full flower, and they are full of textural quality, this hydrangea. Not only are their leaves kind of got this furry, velvety feel, they go a brilliant red in the winter, and they do hold on to their leaves in a sheltered position, so they have tremendous seasonal interest. Now the planting also is signifying that element of when someone's going through a degree of pain, there can often be beauty. So there was this flat undertone of green, quite a horizontal plane, but through that there were these punctuations of flowers, so be it the digitalis snow thimble, the acanthus that I've just shown you, the Nectaroscordums. They were sword-like features punching up through the planting, creating this kind of spiky, uncomfortable situation, but the flowers on them were signifying that in dark times, in difficult times, there can be things of beauty, or certainly things of joy along the way. So we wanted to recognise that people going through problems, their lives aren't necessarily full of chaos. They can have elements where they are achieving, be it in work or in their family lives or in their personal lives socially. And I think the planting was a highlight for me. The coming together of the trees, the shrubs and the herbaceous planting meant that we created this space that was very tranquil, very calming, and delivered on this, creating this kind of enclosure and this place of safety. So the garden was a great opportunity to get a number of people involved, from the 22 apprentices at ID Verdi, who now can associate themselves with a gold medal winning garden. I think they enjoyed that process, both experiencing the build, being involved in the briefings beforehand in terms of understanding the design and the process, but also the show week, where they were supporting, manning the stand and interacting with the public, showcasing their work and really showcasing the campaign, Family Action and ID Verdi as organisations. And that experience, I had it, wind the clock back now, over 15 years ago, where you're a student and you have that opportunity to go behind the gates, experience the atmosphere of the build, which is like no other, and almost catch the bug and want to go back year after year. So I'm really pleased we managed to make that happen. And the Escape Community Allotment in Swaffham, so heavily involved in the project from the start. We got them involved in the storytelling behind the campaign, to share their monsters, we held a session there where we painted our monsters on the pebbles, which then were placed in the garden in the still water pool. And they also grew some of the plants, some of the Nectaroscordums that featured in the garden were grown by Escape. And importantly, they came down and they saw the garden in all its glory, both contributing to the planting and came back during show week. But also hidden amongst the planting was a organic monster made from woven willow, adding some textural qualities and interest to the garden, but also recognising that monsters aren't necessarily these big, bulky, heavy weights. They can just be these things that might be short term, but they quite quickly regenerate, quite quickly can be overcome, and that's what that organic monster was trying to signify. And the result? Well, the result was a gold medal winning garden, which also won best in its category, so best artisan garden. And that result, I mean, essentially no designer won't be aiming for a gold medal at Chelsea, but it was the response of the public, just overwhelming positivity coming from the public, and certainly after the show, the constant correspondence with it being people appreciating the garden, appreciating the campaign, or wanting to support the campaign, and not least the number of people that were signposted to help and support as a result of seeing the garden at the show or seeing it within a social media context. So we had a significant reach, and I think the value for both organisations was, I don't think anybody could have really estimated what that would be, but it exceeded the expectations of both organisations in terms of what it did to promote both the Family Monsters project, Family Action as a charity, and ID Verdi as a business that works and embeds itself in its communities. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the background behind the garden. I've certainly enjoyed reflecting on the achievements 12 months ago and just reminding myself of the journey to Chelsea, how enjoyable it was, and how much in this year where the Chelsea Flower Show is not happening in a physical sense, just how much it's missed, and how much I'm looking forward to the show coming back in 2021.